Say the word and you'll be free. Say the word and be like me. Say the word I'm thinking of. Have you heard the word is love? It's so fine, it's sunshine. It's the word love.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to our community forum on domestic violence. On behalf of the YWCA and One Nation, we'd like to thank all of the panelists for your willingness to be here today. My name is Vilma Martinez Dominguez. I am the Director of Social Justice Initiatives at the YWCA of Greater Lawrence. And just here, it's a pleasure because it's the YWCA of Greater Lawrence is the primary provider of services for domestic violence and sexual assault victims, not only in the Greater Lawrence area, but also in Haverhill and the North Shore. So I'm really happy to be here, and I'm happy to have to serve as your moderator for today. Just wanted to give you a little bit of information about One Nation. One Nation's Diversity is a social responsible organization that promotes growth in underserved communities through the working progression of hindrances of violence and retardants that stifle the advancement of youth and families through empowerment and identity trainings. They have reached out to us to do some of this work for you today. They have a vested interest in this matter. They want to embed themselves in some of the work that's happening locally, and to us, it's a pleasure. The YWCA of Greater Lawrence, or the YWCA period of the USA, really, our mission is eliminating racism and empowering women while promoting peace, justice, freedom, and dignity for all. So you can see sort of the connections here with these two organizations. Our goal ultimately today is to raise awareness about the topic of domestic violence, gain some of individual perspectives from each one of you from your field or your areas of expertise to move on, achieve some safety and self-sufficiency, and basically explore some of the potential solutions, sort of thinking also outside the box for what can be done in addition to what's already happening. So thank you very much. The way that this is going to happen, and I'm going to start with introductions of each one of you, so people know who are our panelists today. But also the instructions are basically, we're going to start with, after I introduce each one of you, I'm going to give you a couple of minutes to talk about who, what your field of work and organization and services, so people get a sense of who's at the panel. And then after that, we're going to start asking a series of questions, but we also want your perspective. And so, are you ready? All right. All right. We have here today with us State Representative Diana DeZoglio. Diana DeZoglio, represents the 17th Essex District, which includes Andover, Lawrence, and Methuen. We also have Kelsey Brandon, and Kelsey Brandon works for the YWCA of Haverhill, and she's our domestic violence and sexual assault counselor. We have, to my left, Mr. Dan Lebowitz. He's the executive director of the Center for the Study of Sport in Society. Thank you for being here. And lastly, but not least, right? Debo Brown from the Debo Show. So we get also sort of this media opportunity for media to be at the table, and I think it's important. Some people don't think so, but media sets the public agenda. And so today I'm hoping that we can set the public agenda in the right direction. Thanks for having me. Great. And so we're going to start with just giving you a couple of minutes. I'm going to start from my far right, just to talk a little bit about what are some of the services that your organization provides, and we'll take it from there.
Okay. So I'm from YWCA Haverhill, which is one of the YWCA of Greater Lawrence offices, and what we do at the YWCA depends on how much time you have. So many services. So we do crisis intervention and primary prevention against domestic violence, sexual assault, stalking, and human trafficking. So we have one-on-one short-term trauma-informed crisis counseling. We have support groups. We offer groups for teens and young adults and folks from other disenfranchised populations. We do a ton of community outreach. We do emergency sheltering, referrals. We have a 24-hour crisis hotline and a 24-hour medical service.
That's just a handful. Thank you very much. So I can see how you can contribute a lot to the conversation today. So Deanna?
My name is Diana DiZoglio. Thank you so much for the invitation to participate in this amazing panel here today. I feel very honored to sit amongst the guests that you have here today. I was talking to them before the show, actually, and got to hear some great stories about the great work that you all do. So thank you for having me. I represent 4 communities. I actually represent North Andover, Lawrence, Haverhill, and Methuen.
Oh, my Lord.
No, that's okay. Our great colleague, Frank Moran, actually represents Andover, Lawrence, and Methuen, and he works side by side with me actually on the issue of domestic violence, as well as our partner, Juana Matias, who's also one of our colleagues here in the city of Lawrence, working hard on the domestic violence front at the state level. As far as what we do as state representatives, as state legislators, is we work on the state budget first and foremost. We vote on funding priorities, and in particular as it pertains to the issue of domestic violence and social justice. I in particular think it's very important that we fight for certain programming that helps to combat the issue of domestic violence in our communities, such as the YWCA, such as Delamano Inc., and other services that we have here, such as the Mayor's Health Task Force. So we fight for funding to come back to our communities to make sure that those social programs are fully funded to the need that they deserve, so that they can better serve our constituents in our communities. And we also vote on different legislative priorities, legislation that is filed as bills that become laws that people have to follow. So when it comes to things like increasing penalties for violent offenders or making sure that the person being abused, the victim, is actually protected, we work on legislation to address those ongoing issues to keep combating this crisis. So happy to be here today, and I'll get into a little bit more about what we do more specifically after everyone has a chance to introduce themselves. But once again, thank you for having me.
Thank you. Policymakers important at the table, absolutely. And next we have Dan Lebowitz.
Two tough intros to follow. I'm Dan Lebowitz. I'm the executive director of the Center for the Study of Sport and Society. We're at Northeastern, and we're a social justice organization, but we're an organization that builds social justice off a platform of sport. We've done primary prevention of domestic violence work and healthy relationship work at the South African World Cup, for the NFL, for Major League Baseball, for every single college conference in the country, for the military, because basically for us, we look at 5,000 years of the promulgation, largely violence started by men upon women, as an outgrowth of hypermasculinity. And we look at what those contexts look like, what the construct of manhood is that we put forth, and we develop training that allows people to gain cognitive developments around the skill set and a toolkit to become proactive bystanders to prevent domestic violence moving forward. Also at the center, we have a program that we just wrote. We used to be known for a program called Project Teamwork. We stay in 2 major lanes, violence prevention and racial justice. Project Teamwork was an internationally known program that had been acclaimed quite a bit, but generally, when you have a program that's been acclaimed and it becomes empirically based, it's now too old. So we wrote a new curriculum called Don't Hate the Player, and we presently have done that at a number of colleges. And it really is a public health look, looking at the issue of racism through a lens of public health. What does racism look like? What are the impulse reactions that it creates, not only for the people that racism is promulgated upon, but by the people that promulgate it? And we create a dynamic in training that allows for people, again, to be in a facilitated dialogue and face conversations that they normally wouldn't have. The last thing is that because we're athletes, we generally don't bow down in the space, we're not nervous in the space, and we feel we can address hypermasculinity because we've lived in that locker room space and understand sort of how that hypermasculinity germinates there and in other cultures like it. Thanks again for having me, and feel blessed to be on the panel with so many people.
So excellent to see that the role of education, working with men about promoting positive, masculinity, it's important. And also the role of innovation, because you can get some of the programs that sometimes we miss the boat there. We have the communities change, so also the programming needs to change, right, to adapt to that. So thank you, and great to have you. And then last but not least, Deba Brown.
Thank you. Thank you, Wilma. Debo Brown of the Debo Show. Basically, what I do is I take social issues that are currently affecting primarily my city, and that being the city of Lawrence. But the reason why I thought it was very important for me in the show to be here today was because I know when I first met you, it was right around the time that obviously domestic violence had come into my life and taken the life of a very good friend. So for me, it's so important for me to be here because this is a learning opportunity for me as well. Because a lot of my viewers, be it young ladies, middle-aged ladies, or even elderly ladies, it doesn't matter. Domestic violence is really affecting such a wide spectrum of people, if you will. And the biggest message that I'm getting from a lot of my female viewers is that they don't think that there's options. And they don't know that there's so many resources and avenues that they can pursue to try to better themselves or the situation that they're in. And more importantly, who they can pick up a phone and call right now. So again, I can't thank you enough for having me because, like I said, this is going to be a real good opportunity, not only for myself to learn what these resources are, but a lot of young ladies in the area that feel that they have nowhere to turn, they're also watching as well, and they're going to get the information. So thank you. I'm honestly blessed to be here with everybody on this panel. I've spoken with Representative DeZoglio before, so it's a pleasure to be back with her. And again, I just look forward to getting the message out.
Excellent. And so why are we doing this? Why domestic violence? And I'm just going to give you two statistics, but I think that one of the things, I wear a couple of hats, and one of them has to do with public health, because you really can't separate domestic and community violence from public health, from public safety. I mean, those three things go hand in hand. And many times when they're doing community health needs assessments and things like that, one of the things that I'm always voicing is, okay, we need to start collecting data around really domestic violence as an issue, as a public health issue. And I'm seeing some of that happening right now, little by little. But this is why we need to do something about do a better job actually at collecting data to truly understand the issue. So when 1 in 3 women and 1 in 4 men, so you can see it's getting pretty close. That gap is closing. It used to be primarily women who were survivors or victims. 1 in 3 women and 1 in 4 men have been victims of some sort of physical violence by their intimate partner in their lifetime. And so this, I hope it comes up during our conversation, because many times we tend to talk about domestic violence in the context of women. Yes, women tend to be the primary victims, and sometimes the victims who receive the major injuries. But that doesn't mean that there's not men in abusive relationships. And then 1 in 4 women and 1 in 7 men have been victims of severe physical violence. So there's some sort of violence and then severe physical violence, and that proves my point that I just said. When it comes to really looking at who goes to the emergency room, you're going to see a lot of women. This is an issue. I know that we are in the courts, both in Haverhill and Lawrence, and just the volume of people looking for safety and restraining orders and protections and information, I mean, every year exceeds, at least for Lawrence, 800, 900. So this is an issue. It's an issue because we had several murders in the recent years. I mean, we've had several ones in Lawrence. And so when you start to see the impact it has in communities, we need to pay attention. And so this forum really serves to both for us to really raise awareness, but also start thinking outside the box to figure out what can we do differently to contribute to what we're doing. So what my process for the panel was going to be basically to give you an opportunity, if you haven't done so in your introduction, to give your perspective on this issue. Not solutions, not anything else, but what is your perspective? What's your opinion about this? And then we're going to move on to looking at some other things that are more specific. So we can start with Kelsey again. So your perspective on the issue of domestic violence as a provider right now. Yes.
I think one of the most important things for folks to recognize when we're addressing domestic violence as a community is domestic violence can look so many different ways. I think we have this idea from popular media, like from movies and TV, that For example, the man is always the abuser, the woman is always the victim. As a provider, I know that to not be the case, that it's always physical. There's always some kind of physically violent component. That's also not always the case. And that's something that we see, especially our younger survivors, especially teens, really struggle with, is identifying what behaviors are abusive and which aren't. So I think we need to work on broadening our perspective of what domestic violence and intimate partner violence and teen dating violence actually look like.
So, very good point, because we tend to, again, just focus on women, but not acknowledge the LGBTQ community, the lesbian, gay, transgender community, who are oftentimes, in the immigrant community, which is another one, who oftentimes are facing very different barriers. I mean, similar in some ways, but just added barriers. Maybe that's the better language. So it's great if we can, maybe we can, during our conversation, talk a little bit about that. So thank you very much. Diana, as a legislator.
As a legislator, to be honest with you, I mean, representatives are just that. We are representatives. So my title is state representative. A lot of people think that means that I represent the state to the people in my communities, but it's actually the complete opposite. What I do is I represent all of you who are watching today, and I represent everybody here to the state of Massachusetts when I go up to Beacon Hill in Boston, and we discuss issues there that are pending that we need to vote on that are going to impact people statewide. I'm a representative for those 4 communities that I listed. City of Lawrence, where we're currently at. So when I think about this topic, I think about what my role in all of this is, what our role as representatives is, and what I feel like the thing that we have been trying to focus on the most at this time is really making sure that we are hearing from the advocates first and foremost, that we're talking to the victims, that we're talking to the people representing the victims, that we're talking to their families, that we're actually hearing that one-on-one perspective that you don't get by reading an article, that we are actually addressing the concerns of the providers, such as the YWCA and other groups, because the providers are the ones that are actually in the trenches doing the work of helping people to get out of these situations. And we as legislators and representatives are supposed to take those experiences, understand those experiences, and be able to vote on those things at the state level. From some of the things that have happened lately around this area, as you know and everybody here knows, some of the tragedies that we've seen in the city of Lawrence recently, my focus has actually turned to the area of prevention and education, where, once the crime is committed and it's too late, what can you do besides try to make sure that it doesn't happen again? So I've been focusing recently on trying to draft legislation, which we could talk about a little bit later, but that really focuses in on prevention and education, identifying who is having these issues, who is being abused, who these victims are, making sure that those people are identified, whether it's a man or a woman, then making sure that they have a resource available to them, that they're educated about how to find those resources, how to seek those resources out, and about the fact that if they do contact those resources, if they do utilize those resources, that there are safe options for them. A lot of people don't know that. They still think that if they contact somebody, if they tell somebody, that they're going to be in trouble or their partner is going to find out, and it's not going to be a good situation for them, and it'll just get worse. There are a lot of different avenues now for victims of domestic violence to turn to or to use, and we want to make sure that as a state representative, as a state legislator, we are connecting with the advocates in our communities, connecting with those victims, hearing from them, and translating that into statewide policy initiatives.
Excellent. Yes, we've had our few shares of discussions around certain policies because, true to her word, and kitchen tables, by the way.
Kitchen table conversations.
Yes, those are the best. Talking about the impact of some of the legislation, whether it's new or old, it doesn't matter. You can always tweak it. So thank you, because I think that policy has a huge place at the table for combating the issue. So thank you very much. Dan.
I think we're a primary prevention. We run a primary prevention program, and it's called MVP. And so we actually were just in Lawrence. We were in Haverhill at the Haverhill High School. We were in Lawrence at Lawrence High. And actually I brought a colleague who does all of my training, Lisa Markland, and writes all the amazing curriculum that we have. So I want to make sure that people understand that there's people behind all this work. But we're a primary prevention organization, right? So MVP MVP, when I said that we as a center train all these entities, whether it's Major League Baseball or the NFL or anywhere else, we're focused on education and training. We're focused on how do you change normative culture? Because even though the numbers are changing, and even though we think that we often go right to men's violence against women, we still live in a culture that's largely defined by a patriarchal structure. And that patriarchal structure runs as deep as women getting paid 70 cents on the dollar for what men are doing, right? And so a lot of what we see is the mimicking, again, of that patriarchal culture. And a lot of the normative culture that gets saturated and becomes infests all of our communities is because we've embraced that hypermasculinity as a norm, right? And not only men have embraced that hypermasculinity as a norm, people in the LGBTQ community have done it, right? Women have done it, and yet there's something wrong with that normative culture. And so what we're trying to do is look at hypermasculinity, look at a pyramid of violence, and start talking about microaggressions. What do microaggressions look like? How do microaggressions lead to other things? To sort of piggyback on all the great points over here was that, the problem when most people look for policy solutions, they look at the top of a pyramid and they think they're going to intervene in a murderscape. But in communities all over the state and all over the country, in these global leagues, everywhere around the world, people are living in trauma, right? Really, we were living in this incredibly large traumascape that has still really been largely defined by that hypermasculinity and by patriarchal structure. And so, whether we look at national elections, whether we're looking at the 70 cents on the dollar equation, no matter what we're looking at, it kind of comes back down to what are we doing to change that normative culture in a middle school and in a high school. And so we look at it in that regard, and we've been fortunate. We used to get a lot of state money when the state was really healthier in that regard, right? But the Patriots Foundation, Bob Kraft and the Patriots Foundation teamed up with the Attorney General, and they run a program called Game Change, and we implement that program around the state in 98 high schools. And so our goal is to always, how do you create a dynamic in a high school that then those high school students can create a near-peer model and go into a middle school where they're revered, so that you're changing the normative culture pipeline that will eventually change that high school culture, that will change those kids' college culture, that will eventually change larger culture.
Wow, I loved everything you said, because I think that we cannot also leave oppression and racism out of this picture. Yes.
I just want to say one thing about that. Is I went down to North Carolina. We spoke at I was lucky enough to speak at a 1,000-person luncheon at a foundation where the father's daughter was murdered by an employee of the Kansas City Chiefs. And, 1,000 people showed up in that room. And I started the speech by saying that if you're not here to talk about race, we can't talk about domestic violence, because you cannot compartmentalize social justice. So I think the larger thing that we all want to be cognizant of is that we tend to compartmentalize social justice. So this is my cause, or this is my cause. And yet social justice is about access to fairness. Social justice is about really creating equality. Social justice is not saying I care about domestic violence, but I don't mind racism, or that I can't get with the Black Lives Matter movement, because you shouldn't be in the room.
Yes.
If you're in the room, become part of the collective solution, not part of the problem. Become part of the collective whole, and sort of leave and face your individual biases. I'm not asking you to leave them at the door. I'm asking you to face them. We're asking as a group to face them. So when Lisa's writing curriculum or we're doing the training, it's about providing a safe place for people to face those biases and understand how they're sort of infecting, through that same public health lens, all the other issues around.
So, no, just to wrap up with Dan, one of the things, and it links up to what Kelsey was saying about, let's broaden the definition of domestic violence and include other groups. When you talk about unequal pay, I mean, you talked about 78, 79, I don't know, it's gone on like 2 cents per dollar that a woman makes, about that per dollar a man makes. But if you really looking at race, If you look at African American women and if you look at Latina women, that dollar that goes all the way down to like 55 cents. And so we really need to look at that. You need to look at the issue of maternity. I mean, we are the ones who oftentimes, how does maternity leave oftentimes leads to financial instability. Men typically don't have to think about those things. And so, and then the last thing is about the other forms of domestic violence. And so everybody focuses on the physical one, but the emotional, the financial one, the use and abuse of children, all these other things sort of that could be included, women and men. And so one of the things that I didn't mention is that I also, on the side, as a consultant, run a batterers intervention program. And that is one of the things that we're trying to combat, some of the things that you talked about. So thank you. And
Thank you.
the YWCA does have a grant from the Patriots Foundation. Yes. So thank you for that. Debo.
All right. Dan had said when we first started that he sat in the wrong seat because he had to follow two excellent points, but I mean, I'm sitting here speechless.
I
After
know.
you. It's like, how do you even follow up on that? But I'll give you my best. I think my perspective on domestic violence is this is an issue that has plagued not only Lawrence but the world for quite a long time. But what's happening now is that people are actually talking about it. And the fact that you gave me the quotes earlier, that it was 1 in 3 women and 1 in 4 men, tells me that it's not an issue that's being pushed into a closet or ignored or just not spoken about. The fact that there's 1 in 4 men tell me that men are now reporting it as well. So there's no longer that stigma of, oh, I should be embarrassed or I don't want to say anything. People are recognizing that this is an issue. And I think that's amazing. I think that by continuing these discussions and having these panels, it's just going to bring more and more positivity to a situation that was previously just left in a negative light. What I have done is I have reached out. I know I've sent you a couple of requests, but the problem is that obviously you see my show. I'm so busy. Diana's so busy. We're just all in our lanes, but it's not that we're not progressing in what we're doing. We're all working together to achieve a common goal. And I think that's very, very necessary to achieve the goal that we're trying to achieve here, because as the first panelist had said, it affects even high school kids. Mm-hmm. And that breaks my heart that it only seems like it's getting younger and younger. So it's not just a grown person's problem anymore. It's really more across the board now. And I think that's very important for everyone to address and realize, because when everyone's on the same page, now we're going to see it being combated from all levels. You got the Debo show going at it from the street perspective, talking to people out there. I'm not that guy that's afraid to say something to someone if I see them, mistreating a lady, or even a lady mistreating a guy, because one of the things that I noticed as well that you had mentioned was sometimes they use the kids against the other partner, and that is so prevalent in Lawrence now. And it's not even just from guys; it's from girls too. What they'll do is it'll be a situation of, oh, well, I can't be with you. Well, you can't see your kids. Or you want to see your kids, give me $1,000 in child support. These are all mechanisms of domestic violence. And that's the important part, to educate people. And I'm glad that Representative DeZoglio is working as far as bringing this into a curriculum and getting it into the schools and really focusing on the education side, because the more that we drive this problem home and the more we get people to talk about it, I think we're going to have a better chance at not solving it, but bringing people to the table to discuss it.
So a couple of things about what you just mentioned is just gender violence is a global issue.
Exactly.
Absolutely. I mean, otherwise the United Nations wouldn't be involved in so many levels. And the other thing is that you're looking at children, and we're looking at youth and adults, and we tend to focus on the primary victims and not think about secondary victims, which is our children. And it has been proven that children have that either witness or the children that witness domestic violence get the same trauma and impact as the children who get actually abused in those relationships. So the impact's there. The message, we're role models, right? We're all role models. You don't, you have to act what you're trying to teach, not just by mouth, but, and then the last thing will be, media has a huge role.
It does.
I mentioned that about dictating the public agenda. And I think media has a responsibility of getting the focus away from the victim and more on the systems and more on the policy piece. And so that's what I'm hoping that we, moving forward, that's some of the things that we need to do. What does she do? What does she say? I think we need to move away from that and more like, what is so difficult for women or men to get out of this kind of relationship? So I'm hoping that the media can pick that up moving forward. And remember, this is about power and control. That's what domestic violence is all about, power and control. And oftentimes, when the victim has regained some of that power, unfortunately, sometimes that negotiation with children also happens, as much on both sides. But, all right. So with that in mind, I'm going to give you about 3 to 5 minutes to answer a few questions. And some of this you have answered to a certain degree. But in your opinion, what progress do you believe has been made in addressing the issue of domestic violence in our communities? What's working well? So we start again with Kelsey.
So one thing that the YWCA of Greater Lawrence and my office, YWCA Haverhill, I think is doing incredibly well is we are starting this conversation younger and younger and younger every year, which I think is crucial. And it's not just because I love to hang out with kids. You know, I think some people have the idea that domestic violence sort of occurs in a vacuum. Like we become adults and all of a sudden these issues confront us. And that's not how that works. We all know that that's not how that works. So first it was getting into the colleges, and then it was getting into the high schools with programs like the Game Change program, which is so much fun to carry out, by the way, just so you know, we love it. And now, you know, we're in the middle schools and we're talking to these young girls, these 10, 11, 12-year-old girls about having positive body image, having positive self-esteem, being able to settle conflicts in a mutually respectful way. Like these are all the tools that they need as young people to be able to move into healthy relationships as adults, both not to perpetrate and to have enough respect for themselves and to recognize the signs of unhealthy conflict early enough to see those red flags when they come up as adults.
So you're referencing a lot of the prevention piece, which I think it's amazing because we need to start early.
Yeah.
When we go to the intervention side of things, what do you think it's, and not just the YWCA, but in general, what are providers doing well?
I think one thing that providers are doing really well in our area is talking to each other. I think just like Dan, you said a few minutes ago that you can't compartmentalize when it comes to social justice. This idea of staying in our lane doesn't really work so well. We all have to sit around the table together. You can't talk about domestic violence and not talk about race and not talk about substance abuse and not talk about homelessness and not talk about food insecurity and talk about all these other things because they are all part of the same problem, which is systemic oppression. So I think being able to pick up the phone and call that expert in that field, whether it be me about domestic violence, whether it be somebody from Community Action about helping somebody keep their lights on, whether it be somebody at Emmaus House about getting a roof over somebody's head, like these lines of communication need to be open at all times. And I do think that's something that we do really well.
I think so too. I agree with you. Mobilizing and working in collaboration is key. I don't think anybody can do this work alone. It takes a village. So thank you. And Diana.
I'm actually going to just piggyback on what you said, and you know, there's obviously going to be a lot of repetition here because apparently we have a lot of the same opinions on things. But and I love what you said, in particular talking about the collaboration. The only way that I can be effective, the only way that policymakers can be effective is if we have that collaboration, as we were talking about earlier. But what I have seen to work in cases where I have actually been called as a state representative to help in domestic violence situations, and I'm not an expert. I don't work in this, type of a facility. I'm not a social worker. I'm not a licensed counselor. I'm a policymaker. When somebody calls my office, though, what I am able to do because of these types of resources, like everybody here, these different groups, is build upon that collaboration, develop those partnerships with that group so that when somebody calls, I know which groups that I know which groups I need to call. I know if I need to call the Y, I know if I need to call somebody else. I know if I need to call, the police department. I know where I need to call and why because of that collaboration. And that partnership is developed, I think, mostly by the advocates. And I think that what we can do better, honestly, Vilma, is make sure that as policymakers that we are demanding that collaboration from other elected officials and from ourselves to make sure that we have those resources, we're educated about those resources, so that when we do get that phone call, that unexpected phone call, we're able to help that person and transfer them to the appropriate resource immediately to prevent, a tragedy. As far as other things that are working, I just like to build upon the work that's already been done in the advocacy aspect and in the outreach aspect. Delamano Inc. in particular, I've been working on trying to get them funding for the last couple of years, actually. They work in prevention and education and intervention in the community, and they work with English-speaking and Spanish-speaking population. So the problem comes when they don't have the funding that they need, though, to be able to provide the resources that they have to offer. So I believe that providing those resources to them so that they can get their message out there, so that they can do the work that they have the experience in doing, is really key, and I think that we can build upon that.
All right, so I think that from the legislators' point of view too, I know that there's one time a year that we officially, providers of domestic violence and sexual assault services sort of meet up, and it just happened recently, meet up with our legislators. And I think that having your year, because usually we have to either call ahead, book appointments. I think, in my opinion, that's happening really well. We're able to get through that piece. Not only can we meet with you locally, but also the day of the Legislative Advocacy Day. And then the other thing I want to add to that is the work of the coalition, Jane Doe, the Coalition Against Sexual Assault and Domestic Violence, that they work around policy. I think that there's a very true partnership between the coalition and the representatives, the elected officials. It could be representatives, it could be senators. And I think that relationship has been built and it's very strong, and it trickles down actually to the local efforts. So I think that that's definitely something that I have to say, and I can attest that that's a strength. Dan, what do you think? It's working well right now in our field.
I think, give it again, because our lens is mostly primary prevention. I think what's working well is designs that are meant to make things sustainable in other structures. So just like we talk about not staying in silos, so that, for us, I never want to, whether it's Major League Baseball that would pay us quite a lot of money to keep coming back, I'm trying to figure out how do you make that sustainable in the league so it becomes part of what they're doing, so that the ownership is, I think one of the problems that we have in social justice is people that don't live in Lawrence, or people that aren't African American and live in a community, or Latino or whatever, they're always telling other people what would solve their problems, right? So we never think that the people on the ground know what would solve their problem. Know that, just because someone's victimized doesn't mean that they probably couldn't help in a solution if we can empower both them and the people around them, right? So we often look at our work as if we're watching a middle school fight, right? So there's generally a couple of combatants in the middle, and they only have this option. They have to fight or flight, right? And then there's a group around them that's always watching that, right? And instead of being empowered, again, with that skill set or toolkit, and in some sort of a sustainable fashion to intervene safely and create a new dynamic, maybe just take one of those people out of the circle, they're yelling fight, 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 right? Mm-hmm. Because they freeze in the moment. They become sort of caught in the cloak of, I'm not going to get involved, or because I'm in a crowd, I can't be singled out, so I'm going to become part of the problem, right? So I think what's working well is when we empower people to be activists in their own community. So for us, we have a curriculum. I'm not looking to come back to a school 25 times. I'm looking to figure out, if the Patriots Foundation or the state or anybody else is kind enough to give the money to figure out how we can address the problem, we better be sitting down and really being intentional and thoughtful about how not only we address it in the immediate sense, but how we make it sustainable. So when we're at a Haverhill or we're at Lawrence or somewhere else, the goal is, We've been at certain high schools for 10, 12 years. Those programs run by themselves, and national organizations will come in and film those organizations, and that's really our biggest win. You know, I don't want it to circle back to us, right? Because we're here to create a solution. We're here to try to figure out what does a solution look like. And once you create that solution, you don't want the reward. The reward is already that the community themselves were empowered or embraced or someone actually heard their voice. So I think what's working well is when we start thinking about high schools as a bunch of educators that if they had the skill set and toolkit, they could carry that education on. We start thinking about kids as the excellent brand wearers that they are, that they could create the near peer model that would really change a middle school from the high school level. I mean, you're the head of your theater department or your best athlete or you know, a number of people go into that middle school, they're revered. So how do you leverage that in a way for positivity all the time? Youth development is a very, you know, is, for us, we look at it as sort of part and parcel with what youth development is. And if you look at the frontal lobe of men, and they'll tell you that the frontal lobe of men will be developed by 25 or 28, well, I'm 58, and mine might have just kicked in. So you start to think, when you're a man and you really want to be self-effacing about your ability or your ability to face your own bias, or you look at gender inequity, and you start to realize the amazing, it's sort of the lie that's been told for 5,000 years that we're smarter than women or we're more powerful than women or all the things that we promulgate as men, which brings me back to that patriarchal piece. I think what's working well is when in our organization, when people that live in that hypermasculine space, when men are acting like allies to females but not thinking that they're leading females, we're not leading anything, right? We're creating a dynamic where all we're trying to do is be the best ally we can be. So if we can figure out how to be a better ally, if we can use our curriculum to create sustainability, if that sustainability can empower people not only to make movement on the issue, but to validate themselves, right? I mean, in many senses, most people are looking for identity validation in this world, right? Most people are living in that traumascape and no one's validating them. And yet, everybody's validatable, right? So I think what's working well is when we break it down to the point where we let people understand the greatness in them, and we create a sustainable model that lets them sort of be empowered and refreshed in that greatness every single day.
You brought a few points. Addressing systemic issues are very difficult. So sometimes those are the barriers to making something sustainable. And so we see that in so many places. So even, you know, be it a public school, be it a community organization, it doesn't matter where it is. State government agency where many of our victim survivors go to seek services. So systemic issues are huge, and that's what actually makes it very difficult to sometimes do things in a sustainable way. The fact that it's a comprehensive approach. So it takes a community. So yes, we need to educate our youth and make sure that we incorporate these things, but also the teachers, but also the principal, but also the pastor from the community, but also, I mean, the provider that's sitting over there on the other side of DTA. And so this is a massive undertaking, but we can't think about it that way. We have to think about it within our own world and space. How can we influence systemic change? And so that's one of the things. And then shifting attitudes takes a long time. You know that, right? So shifting attitudes about women and, male privilege, which you were talking about, and all of these other things, that takes time, but it needs to be modeled, and we cannot give up because it may look like a monster, but we're making inroads, I think, right?
And I think you bring up some great points. When we trained Major League Baseball, and Lisa ran most of that training for us, we wouldn't do it unless the front office was being trained and the managers were being trained, and the baseball operations people were being trained, and the players were being trained, and it went all the way down the line, right? But to Major League Baseball's credit, they really embraced in that entirety, right? They embraced it in entirety. They were looking for a sustainable systemic change, right? They did not want to be a global league that wasn't on the forefront of this issue. So whether it's them or the NBA that really is the only global league that's really embraced social activism around racism, where we have conversations with them about what that looks like. Whether it's from the top or whether it's starting organically from the ground, either way that you approach it, you really have to figure out ways in which everybody from top to bottom has to be educated, and yet you have to create safe spaces. You can't have your manager in with your players because then they won't,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
So we had to really think about all these ways around sustainability. And as you say, normative culture moves very slowly. But if you don't make all these inroads to change it little by little in the institutionalization process, you'll never get to that outcome. And so we're trying to look at everything like a logic model outcome, right? You have your challenges. You have limited resources, right?
Mm-hmm.
But you have your own personal energy, your mission, your organization's mission. You have all these allies around you. So how do you look at that as a collective whole and then start looking at those resources as a strength so you get to that logic model outcome, which is equality, real equality,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
Equality where people are wondering, through that empathy lens, not I'm feeling pity for that person, but what does it feel like to be an African-American female? What's the world looking like through her eyes, or a Latino female, or an African-American male? So these are the things that we look at. Sustainability really comes with, are we doing our research as well? In Boston, there's an inordinate number of African-American males between 19 and 23 that don't have a job and aren't in college. Now, that's terrorism. And I know that the mayor's working hard on that and his staff's working hard on that. But if it was a white population, people would really be upset about it. So I think that a lot of what we look at, we have to look at privilege. And the people who have privilege have to be self-effacing about the fact that they have that privilege. And the last thing I'll say is that, Lisa's heard me say this a lot, but we live in a world where oftentimes when people are elected leaders at the top, they'll always say that they're an American, and there's a phrase, I'm an American, but nowhere in America really, if you're looking at America as a democracy, nowhere in the world has democracy succeeded without capitalism. And Winston Churchill once said, capitalism is the worst system on the planet, except for every other system. But capitalism doesn't survive unless there's consumerism. And so if your majority populations are changing, and there's going to be a shift, in greater female populations, greater African American populations, greater Latino populations, and those populations are going to be the majority population combined over the white males, you can't say that you believe in America and believe in democracy if you're going to exclude and disenfranchise people from the very consumerism that fuels the capitalism, that fuels the democracy, that creates what you say is great America. So I think, when we look at issues around policy or anything that we do, we want to take the large lens. What's that look like? And then we want to break down what we're doing in our preventative space, which isn't the intervention space, but we need those intervention partners, right? We're trying to figure out, is it thoughtful enough? Is it intentional enough? Do we have a good enough strategic plan? Are we really empowering people? And are we actually coming to a logic model of a better collective whole?
Excellent. So this is deeper than we thought. All right, Diva.
I think what is working really well at this point is the fact that we have, as a society, have taken a stance that this isn't a me problem. This is a we problem. And I think a perfect example of what I'm driving home here is the fact that you have such a wide variety of allies, as you call it, on the panel. You have the YWCA, you have the state of Massachusetts, you have the sports side of it that focuses on young men, in the curriculum side of it through sports, which I think is an amazing thing. And then you have me, who represents the streets. And we have all come to the table to discuss this issue and figure out how we as a society, regardless of gender, political affiliation, personal beliefs, sports beliefs, and where I come from, it doesn't matter. This is an across-the-board problem. And the only way that we're going to continue progressing in this mission that we have of addressing this situation is by continuing this conversation and these dialogues through the legislative side, through the educational side, in every other angle, because it's definitely working. We're seeing results.
So we have about 8.5 minutes left. I know, we've gone along and on. But this is a very long, no, don't apologize. This is good. So I'm going to combine question 2 and 3, and I'm going to ask you to take about 3 minutes, well, 2 minutes actually, so that we can have a proper closing. So what do you think are the greatest needs and challenges of survivors, and how do you think we can sort of begin to address those? And so you work with survivors day in, day out. What do you think are some of the challenges that you're seeing in order for them to achieve self-sufficiency and really truly get out of that unhealthy relationship? And maybe one solution, a potential solution that you see, particularly outside the box, to begin addressing them.
One of the greatest challenges that I see in terms of my own clients making it towards their goals of safety and independence and maybe healthy relationships in the future is the financial component. We often don't think of abuse as involving a financial component, or people in general don't, and it very, very much does. You know, I've had the clients whose abusers have demanded to see receipts every time they go out, who track their cars, who do all these things. And I think giving people the tools to obtain financial independence, whether that be like vocational training, going back to school, whatever they may need, even English as a second language or learned language classes can be a huge, huge helping factor towards making it towards safety and independence, and also just like making our own programs more accessible. We have all said this in our own way. Survivors can be anybody. They can be men. They can be women. They can be from the LGBTQ communities. They can be any age. They can be any race, any religious group, any immigration status, any disability status. Anyone can be a victim. So just making it so our own programs as service providers are as accessible to every population as possible. If that means a wheelchair ramp, if that means translators on call, if that means extra help for folks who may be like visually impaired or hearing impaired, if that means anything.
So I will add to that not only accessibility, but inclusivity. Because sometimes we have all these things that we have set up, but when a person not fitting that box walks in, they don't feel welcome because
Right.
this is not my space. So thank you for sharing that quickly here.
I agree with the need for financial independence, and I think that that's a great point that touches on everything that's been said here regarding the issue of equity, pay equity, gender equity across the board. Just making sure that the person who is being abused can get out of that situation, obtain their financial stability, so that they're not having to constantly go back to this person and rely on them to make sure that they're okay. The issue that I think about is actually the issue of isolation, because when I think about the people that I've talked to who have been abused, and when they explain their circumstance to me, it is that lack of being able to connect with somebody who can actually help them, and the fact that that abuser has isolated them so much from their family, from their friends, from their support group, and they don't have an outlet to actually find somebody who can help them, and then they're not trusting towards strangers, for obvious reasons, because of the fact that they have been abused. And they're fearful of what the consequences might be if their abuser finds out. So the issue of isolation is I think a huge issue, and so that's the issue. One thing that we're doing to address it, one thing that I'm working on to address it, that I've actually spoken to Vilma about this with, is I'm actually drafting a piece of legislation right now that they've actually just passed in the state of Illinois in 2016, which trains hairstylists, nail technicians, estheticians, barbers, makeup artists, cosmetologists, anybody that's in the beauty industry, the hair industry. It trains these people who have this contact with these individuals on a regular basis, that may have formed some sort of a connection with these individuals. Might not necessarily be their best friend, but they had, people come in, if they're being abused, everybody has to go and, get their hair cut at some point, usually, and or go get something done. And when they go in, they tend to develop relationships with these people that are providing these services. If they've been isolated from people in their family, if they've been isolated from their close friends, but they are allowed to go out and get a haircut. They are allowed to maybe go out and get their nails done. They are allowed to maybe go out and get one of these different services. Yes. That's an opportunity. That's a touch that somebody can have to make an impact on them, to provide a resource to them and an opportunity. in the state of Illinois, they passed a piece of legislation that trains these people on the issue of domestic violence. It trains them to recognize signs of domestic violence. A lot of times hairdressers can touch, a lot of times hairdressers, when they're lifting up the hair, they might see bruises. A lot of times bruises are on the head of the victim to hide the bruises from people so that they don't see them when they're going out, so that the abuser's not exposed. Hairdressers have the opportunity to recognize those signs as well as these other people in this field. And right now, I'm filing a very similar bill in the state of Massachusetts that would train people in these fields to recognize the signs of domestic violence and also to be able to provide resources to people if they do recognize signs of domestic violence, and how to approach the person that they see domestic violence being an issue with, to be able to send them over to resource centers that may be able to help them. So that is one area that we are working on in the state legislature right now. That I think and I hope will be very helpful.
So that's definitely an idea, thinking outside the box. So we have about 5 minutes left, but definitely something, the issue of isolation, the way we approach outreach, the way we approach, we tend to be very centered into like domestic violence programs when there's so many other places that people go to that we can tap into that as a resource, as a connection and partner. I'm going to ask you both to take about a minute and a half to make sure we stay on track. Okay. So, greatest need and challenges and one creative solution.
Well, I actually loved both of those solutions. I think that, we work a lot in the space of what workforce development looks like, right? I mean, so whether we're talking domestic violence or whether we're talking racial disenfranchisement from jobs. Yes. I mean, at the end of the day, we're talking about access, right? How do you get access to services? How do you get social access to education? How do you get social access that brings you out of isolation? How do you come in contact with people that can help you? And how do you get information when you've been sort of cut off from information, right? Mm-hmm. So I think that, this is one time where you probably didn't even need to come to this side of the table at all, because I really think that workforce development is, if we talk about gang issues in the country, we talk about it, and people make everything seem like it can't be solved. A lot can be solved if people really wanted to spend time looking at issues and spend time in understanding that workforce development and access to income opportunity creates a whole new dynamic for almost anybody. And, when I mentioned the capitalism being the worst system, but probably the only system that allows people to move out of poverty or move out of those things, how do we get people that access to that capitalism? So
that's excellent, because I think workforce development is an area. We always think about a quick training, a quick referral, and I think we need to think about deeper, like what are we doing? How are we offering this training? What are the barriers to getting this kind of survivors and victims from point A to point B? And I think that's another creative thing, to connect those two things really in a more intentional way. Debo.
I think one of the greatest issues that currently affect the situation is the ignorance. And I say ignorance in the sense that some people will say, well, I don't hit her, or I don't hit him, or I've never stabbed him, or I've never run him over with my car, so I'm not a domestic abuser. Mm-hmm. But in educating, in processing, continuing with the process of the curriculum, I think the educational piece of it is very key in helping people identify what exactly are some of the sub-triggers, such as, like you said, the hyper-aggressions that trigger some of these behaviors. The more we can get people to think about what exactly is the behavior, then I think that's going to help us ultimately end the cycle of domestic violence.
It's interesting because I used to see a lot of media ads around domestic violence in the past, and I don't think I'm seeing them as often anymore. I don't know if you ever see, if anybody noticed. So I think that, again, media, that could be a huge driver for getting that education and reducing that ignorance and removing the stigma around domestic violence. And so that's your big responsibility.
Yes, ma'am.
So before we close out and before I give you sort of a seconds, right, to just give you any final thoughts that you may have, I think that we come to terms with the fact that this is a bigger issue. Then it's just, we need to move on. We need to be creative. We need to be innovative. We need to think outside the box. We need to really get different people from different sectors all together to start talking about domestic violence at a next level, more as a social issue, more as a racial issue, more as a discrimination issue, an oppression issue. So I think that this is really the best example of that. And so it's been a pleasure for me to do this and moderate for you today. I know there's a few seconds left. On behalf of One Nation, once again, and the YWCA of Greater Lawrence, I would love to thank you all for sharing your thoughts today. And I don't know if you have any time to do any final thoughts, but if you have any final thoughts, please share them.
I think we all owe a debt to One Nation and to you.
Absolutely.
Because I think one thing, if we're talking about getting the word out, this obviously allowed us to get the word out, gave us a forum to do it, and then got us outside our lanes again to meet some people we probably didn't know. So I feel really fortunate to be here, both for my center, for the people that really drive my center, like Lisa, and for all the people out there that need the services so desperately.
By the way, before I forget, I know that there has been some phone numbers being listed, at least on the recording. So there are phone numbers to our statewide hotline for domestic violence survivor, as well as for the hotline for the domestic violence and sexual assault programs of the YWCA of Greater Lawrence and Haverhill. So I'm hoping that people will take that number. Feel free to call. Services are confidential, are completely free, and we're not going to be telling you what to do, but rather listening to you or your situation, providing you some choices and options for you to try, as you prepare to leave the relationship if you're ready to do so. So thank you very much. And I see that you have something in your hands.
I don't know if we have time. I got handed this. How much time do we have? We have a few minutes. Great. So I just, on behalf of the state delegation, we just wanted to present to you, myself, Frank Moran, Juana Matias. We have some citations here just to thank you so much from the state of Massachusetts, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, the House of Representatives, and then also on behalf of Senator L'Italian for all the work that you do. And this is for Danielle. And I'm going to read one here, and then we also have one for everybody seated here at the table. It says, "Be it hereby known to all that the Massachusetts House of Representatives offers its sincerest congratulations to Danielle Lebowitz in recognition of your commitment to addressing domestic violence through the MVP and your ongoing partnership, One Nation's diversity. The entire membership extends its very best wishes and expresses the hope for future good fortune and continued success in all endeavors. Given the 7th day of April, 2017, signed by the Speaker of the House, Robert DeLeo, and then your state delegation here in Lawrence. And you all have one of these. We just want to say thank you so much for all the work that you do."
Thank you. Thank you very much, and looking forward to other opportunities.
Till the next time, it's the Debo Show.